Well, look around and see the turnout on this beautiful snowy day, so we're thrilled because it was looking grim about 15 minutes ago. So thank you everyone for coming. Welcome. I'm Ann Pillion. Maybe many or most of you know me. I am the president of the Jackson Historical Society here, and we're very pleased to offer this program today. I want to mention we have Hank Benesh here, and he'll be video recording the event. And when Hank has it edited and ready, we'll be sending out a link. So anyone who wants to watch it again or know someone who couldn't make it, we'll be in touch on how to find that. Before I introduce our speaker, I have 3 announcements to make. First, if for any reason we have to leave the building quickly, we have, actually, can you make sure that's unlocked, that door? We have that one. And just knock everything over and go on stage.
Snow in front of it. Yeah.
No, leave it loose.
We haven't go through the 45. We're not past it. Check on the fire department. Fire chief will take care of it.
How many chairs are over there? Sorry.
Deputy. There's 2, 3, 4.
There's
3 over here. 4. Well, you're
Well,
5.
there's chairs over there.
Need one. Need one.
Make your way over. I'm just doing some intros. Second, the Jackson Historical Society needs you. We are looking, reinvigorating here and looking to for volunteers who would be interested in spending some time here as you desire, a few hours a month or whatever you think you can give us. We have lots of, we put this flyer together, we have lots of different interesting opportunities. And some of them could be done at home even. We have purchased a museum grade software that we can get you access to, and that's something that could be for a lot of different uses. We have it. One is entering in, some of our file information or our collection, photographing or whatnot. There's a lot of different avenues down that. So if we have a bunch of these flyers and it lists what we have, and they're over there on the side. Dawson Winch, one of our board members, can help you find that on your way out. And one other example would be Warren Schumacher here, who has carried this on his shoulders for a very long time, superbly. Well, at 99, I think I don't think I'm giving away your age, Warren, but at 99, he's not always coming in here and having the doors open. So we're really needing to create an outline that we can provide people that are interested in being a docent that can come in here, so we can have a few hours on the weekend open. And thirdly, we have 2 upcoming programs that I wanted to mention. On March 30th, on Thursday at 7 p.m., we'll have the owner of Peter Limmer and Sons Custom Boot Makers. Probably most people, you know, their shop is in Intervale, and Adam Lane Olson is the new owner there. And this is just off the press that he gave me. I think they're looking on rebranding maybe, I'm not really sure, but he'll speak to the history of, which is incredible, vast history and interesting stories that are tied with Limmer boots. And so we'll be advertising that and sending out reminders. That one is on March 30th. And then we will be lucky enough to have PeterBenson back for part 2. Tonight's part 1. Part 2 of this map series. And it will be selected maps of the White Mountains from 1852 to 1902. So a little more recent than tonight.
Before my time.
So now for tonight's program. Part 1 of 3-part map series. Tonight is selected state maps of New Hampshire from 1790 to 1860. And to introduce our speaker, PeterBenson, who will share his deep interest and vast knowledge of New Hampshire and White Mountain maps. Peter is a longtime Jackson resident. He and his wife Emily raised their daughter and son here, and soon I believe they'll be tapping trees and boiling sap. Many of you know Peter's the Jackson Deputy Fire Chief. He's been a volunteer for Jackson firefighter and forest fire warden for 32 years. I personally thank Peter for the many times you were the emergency responder at my parents' house with their age-related incidences. Peter has had a lifelong love for the White Mountains in northern New Hampshire. As a young man, he worked for the AMC's hut system, finishing as assistant huts manager. He worked for years with the Nature Conservancy, managing their preserves, including the Green Hills Preserve in North Conway, and he managed their community development and outreach programs in northern New Hampshire. More recently, Peter worked for the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation as their senior program officer and headed their grant-making programs in northern New Hampshire. He's been on many boards, volunteering countless hours. He's a skier, traveler, fly fisherman, and passionate about White Mountain history, culture, art, books, and maps. Welcome, and thank you, Peter.
That was better than I thought. That was excellent. Better. Not what I sent you. This is a little overwhelming. Wow. I thought, well, maybe we'll get like 20 people. The snow will knock it down, but.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did Dawson Wunsch want to say something?
Oh, sorry. Not only am I a board member here at the Historical Society, but I also work for Tin Mountain. So this is a PSA just to remind you all that first season, our dinner auction, we're back live and in person on Saturday, March 18th at the Old Saco Inn. We encourage people to carpool. It is a little bit further, but it's going to be fun, great dinner, and a lot of great options. So new venue, new menu, and new auction items. Tickets are available at tinmountain.org. Thank you.
And again, non-compliant collaborating with
That's right.
other nonprofits. So,
Anybody else?
I think that's
Any public service announcements? Great. As I said, this is a little intimidating. When Ann first cajoled me into doing this, I was like, I don't know. Maps are nice, and I really love them, but I don't know if everybody shares that love and interest, but I guess I proved myself wrong once again. The challenge here is, as you all can see, is we're looking at some pretty small stuff for the most part, and some of the big stuff we have is under Mylar, which means it's shiny, which means it's hard to see. So I'm going to go through things and point things out, and we'll pass some maps around, and then at the end you can come up and take a look and ask questions. You can ask questions anytime. There are people here that I know have more knowledge about this than I do, and I know you're in the room, and I'll mention some of you by name. So this will take about 4 hours. We'll be done around 9:30. No, I did feel the need to talk about some of the history of New Hampshire and geography and its expansion as it relates to maps, because it kind of for me it ties the story together. But if you listen carefully and you listen to the history, there are several questions, quiz questions, with prizes at the end for those who might get them right. Some things that you might have or that you might not have. So pay attention. We'll be asking questions throughout. So for those of you who want to sleep through the history part, I completely get it. Not everybody's a history geek like I am. As I said, what I love most about maps, and it's always great to come in here because we see so much great art and things, but what I love about maps is the commonality that they share. Everybody can relate to them. There are multiple copies, so you can go to multiple places and see the same thing or similar thing and have that same appreciation. They also are a great source of reference, and we'll look at some of the reference points, especially some of the first half maps up until about 1816, 1820. As I said, and from a collecting standpoint, they tend to be a lot more affordable in most cases than other things like artwork. And you can get really good, I mean, if you're interested, you can get really good reproductions of maps for very little money, $30 or $40 for just about, a lot of these maps are available online for reproduction, So that also makes it kind of interesting. These maps are from my collection and the societies. There are 2 maps from the societies, and the rest are mine. And Ann's going to tell a bit of a story about one of them. So let's get going. When it comes to mapping and maps, there are tons of resources out there. All the major colleges and universities, Harvard, Dartmouth, Plymouth State, University of Southern Maine has an excellent map collection and map library for those of you who don't know. And Museum of the White Mountains, and local historical societies like here in Jackson, Conway, all have great resources when it comes to mapping, as well as places like the Observatory. North Conway Public Library has some good resources. There's tons of information out there. There's also numerous private collectors who have, again, far more knowledge and bigger collections than I have that act as a really good resource. And dealers as well. Dealers are often really, really good sources of information. There's a great online resource about maps, of whitemountainhistory.org. Many of you have probably been on that site. It has a great section on 26, or I think it's like 26 maps of the White Mountains, essential maps of the White Mountains, histories, PDFs that you can blow up. It's a great resource. But there are three sources that really stand out when it comes to maps in my mind, for people looking to further their knowledge in collecting. And the first one is a book that was published by the AMC in 1911 called Ben's Bibliography of the White Mountains. For those of you who don't know it, it's in reprint. You can get it online for like $8-10 off Amazon most days. It's a terrific resource. It was published in 1911 by the AMC. And I consider it one of the two kind of encyclopedias or Bibles for collecting White Mountain stuff. It has a section on White Mountain classic books, poetry, engravings, newspaper clippings. It has pictures of portraits of a bunch of old white men, and has a small section on maps. Fairly incomplete, but it highlights some of the really good maps. It has a wonderful introduction, pretty comprehensive, although there are a few gaps in it, like any anthology like this. The second source is this one. It's called New Hampshire Maps to 1900, an annotated checklist for those of you who are interested in maps. It was published in 1981 by the New Hampshire Historical Society and written by David Acock. Yeah, David Acock. He also did one of a book of Vermont maps. This catalogs over 500 maps from New Hampshire's inception to 1900. It tells about their size, features, publishers, engravings, and engravers, and where the maps can be found in major libraries and historical societies and museums. It also has a great introduction and overview, and it's a really definitive source for New Hampshire maps. It's not complete. You do find gaps in this every once in a while, but it is the best resource we have. And David Cobb is the guru of New Hampshire libraries collections. He's also put out a book on U.S. map resources and over 950 collections where you can go and see maps. So he knows his maps. I think he started at the University of Illinois, and that's where he did most of his work. The third book that I'll mention really quickly, and there's a lot of familiar names in the room and about this book, is this is a book that the Society put out called Scaling the White Mountains, a selection of White Mountain maps. It was published by the Historical Society from an exhibit they did from 2014 to 2015. Peter Crane, where are you, Peter Crane? Did an excellent introduction. Larry Garland was integral in this publishing. Am I missing anybody that's in the room that helped out with this? Aside from Warren, of course. It's an excellent overview of White Mountain maps, but what's really great about it in my mind is it's thinking about how they went about mapping. The first part of the book is about tools and methods they used. It's really an excellent resource. And many of the maps in this book will be featured I'll show in future presentations. I'm sorry. So much has been written about New Hampshire, even I think compared to a lot of other northern New England states, Maine and Vermont, that it can be really hard to know where to begin. I really focus on from post-colonial up until about 1900 maps, but that's a pretty big range. And some of the other areas of interest, and some things I'll touch on today, are the development of New Hampshire counties, population changes statewide, and even how Jackson got its name changes. Also, what's really, excuse me, important about a lot of these maps is how much is missing or wrong, or just flat out wrong. Almost every map here has something that's not right. So there's no such thing as a perfect map. I was going through the Carrigan map with a magnifying glass, and I found what must have been in the typeset, but some of the letters were upside down. So you know, they're little things. I mean, but it can be hard. It can be hard to see. Again, there are huge, especially when we're talking about the earliest maps. There are huge knowledge gaps because early on these maps were being printed in Europe, and they'd never set foot here. They had no idea really what was here. They were taking it on. You'll hear a lot about best information from accurate sources, which was really just looking at the map beforehand a lot of times and putting the same information on even if it was wrong, because nobody was checking them. They had nobody to proof it. So it was really just kind of, they were winging it. And the Europeans were cranking out maps for the New England market well before even these maps came out, mostly for navigation. Those you really wanted to be accurate, and oftentimes they weren't. So I made the effort to show a wide range of maps, not just the rock stars like the Carrigan map, which we'll spend a fair amount of time on, but some of the more plain ones, which do also have a story to tell, not just about the map, but who did the work on the map and what they meant to map making. A lot of these were very mundane maps, just used for educational purposes, and they weren't really meant to influence like we see later maps doing. So from this time period in Cobb's book, we're looking at about 190 maps that he's cataloged. We'll look at about 15 or 16 today, so just a small touch of what is out there. And again, some are iconic, some are pretty basic, but they all have a story to tell. So now, for those of you who don't like history, you can fall asleep on your neighbor next to you or just zone out. But if you'll indulge me, the history part is important, and this is where the questions come in. 1790 to 1850 was a time of incredible change in growth in New Hampshire, the U.S., and New England in general. It was a time of great physical growth. We had acquired the Louisiana Purchase from the French in 1803. Lewis and Clark's expedition happened from 1804 to 1806, which opened up, at least mentally, the West to the rest of the U.S. And in 1848, the winning of the Mexican War tripled the size of this country in a very short period of time. It was a huge expansion. The United States admitted 18 new states from 1790 to 1850 from the original 13 colonies. All of the southern states, except for Florida and Texas, and much of the middle part of the country, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, were all admitted to the Union before Maine was, which is pretty incredible to think about, since it's been sitting right on the water for all that time. Maine was admitted in 1820 as the 23rd state. Speaks to the remoteness and ruggedness of northern New England and the fact that we really had no idea where the border was between Canada and the U.S. for a long time. The border was finally established in 1842. Does anybody know what the treaty was? First question. That established the U.S.-Canadian border in 1842?
Webster-Ashburton.
Bingo, very good. Excellent.
Can you say that again?
Webster-Ashburton.
The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. Daniel Webster, our own Daniel Webster, was the Secretary of State at the time. And they established the boundary roughly, well, there was still some debate, and I'll talk a little bit more about the treaty and why it was important. Does anybody know what else Daniel Webster is famous for when it comes to fishing? Peter Crane.
Does this involve chowder?
No.
That's another story.
That's enough. In 1827, Daniel Webster was purported to have caught the largest, what's our state fish, anybody know?
Brown trout.
Brook trout, brown trout. Brook trout is a New Hampshire state fish. Daniel Webster caught the largest brook trout ever recorded on Long Island, in the Carmans River. It was 14.5 pounds, until another one was caught up in Ontario in 1912. But he had, for many, many years, had the largest brook trout ever caught. So that's, see, I'm diverging. So with the Mexican War ending, Mexico ceded 55% of its land, and the continental US was pretty much solidified, at least on paper. California became the 31st state in the following year, in 1849, even though it wasn't anywhere near contiguous to the rest of the US. The gold rush had happened, and we wanted California as a state. It was a time in the US of relative prosperity, at least for white Americans, and a time of relative economic and international calm. A few major recessions, short decisive wars, including Napoleonic Wars, and which all ended up favorably, either military or economically, for the US. And a looming US Civil War, notwithstanding, they all had impacts on New Hampshire. So the interior of New Hampshire, as you all know and might expect, began to be settled from the major river valleys, the Androscoggin. And we'll talk a lot about the Androscoggin because it has so many names in these maps that you can't really keep track. Connecticut, Saco, and the Merrimack River valleys. And manufacturing and industrialization were just starting to hit their strides, especially in the south, around the major rivers, where they were using their water for the power and transportation. Much of the interior of New Hampshire, including Adams/New Madbury/Jackson, was still small, rural, agrarian, quasi-subsistence farms. Sheep for wool, maple sugar, lumber, and homespun goods were all cash crops. And Jackson was right there with it with all 250 residents. So good maps were necessary to show transportation routes, waterways, and later at the end of this we'll see just the start of the railroads coming in for New England in the 19th century. So as part of this, you'll see when we get started, New Hampshire has how many counties today? Does anybody know? 10 counties, right. We started off with 5. And Bartlett and Jackson have a unique, are the only towns in New Hampshire to have this distinction. Does anybody know what that distinction is? It's related to counties. All right, God,
Seventh grade?
what's that?
Part three? No, I wasn't sure.
They're the only towns that have been part of 3 counties. We originally was part of Grafton County, then we were part of Coos County, and now we're part of Carroll County. And there's some real good reasons for that. We're legislation in 1803. We disannexed from Grafton into Coos County, and then in 1840 we became part of Carroll County. Although all our records were still held in Coos County at the courthouse until the courthouse fire in 1886 burned all of the records. So most of Jackson's early records are gone. And there were probably a fair amount of maps that went along with those, as well as a lot of the other Coos towns. So Jackson became part of Carroll in 1840, and we'll look at maps here. The later maps, all the way through 1850, not only shows us still being called Adams, but it also says we're still part of Coos County. So it just goes to show you the maps are often well behind what was actually happening. Does anybody know who Carroll County was named for? Mr. Carroll. Could be Mrs. Carroll. Did somebody say Charles Carroll? I thought I heard it. Charles Carroll, right. And Charles Carroll was Mrs. Carroll's husband. Charles Carroll was the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he was from Maryland, so he had no ties to New Hampshire, would never been here. But people thought so strongly about the Declaration of Independence that they named Carroll County for him in 1840, 8 years after he died. He was a fascinating guy. Just as a really quick aside, he was a signer of the Declaration, but he couldn't vote on it because he was a Catholic. So he couldn't vote to ratify. He was also sent on a diplomatic mission to French Canada during the American Revolutionary War with Samuel Chase and Ben Franklin to try and persuade French Canada to join the U.S. in the war against Britain, because Charles Carroll was a Catholic. He'd been educated in France in Jesuit schools. They thought he was a good fit. It didn't work. They decided not to join. He was also the largest slaveholder in Maryland, but advocated for gradual abolition. And finally, he was the wealthiest man in Maryland and had formulated the Boston and the B&O canal, which became the B&O Railroad. So he was a really fascinating guy, so we have this really great connection to him, even though he probably didn't know us from the hole in the wall. So that's it for the history lesson. Relieved? So we're going to start. So again, these maps are really small and they're glary, and I'm going to point out a bunch of things, and we're going to go through some a lot more quickly than others, and then spend some more time, and then afterwards you all have questions, you can come up and take a look for as long as you want. So the first map here, and hopefully I won't blind you, Gillian, this is from the Society's collection. I don't know where it came from. Do you have any idea?
Warren, any idea on this map? It's the,
What's that?
what map is it?
It's from 1788. It's a map of New Hampshire, Vermont, and C. It just says C, by William Gordon. This is an interesting map because Vermont was not a state at this point. New Hampshire and New York were fighting over Vermont, and usually, when it came to these kind of border wars, I'm sure Vermont wanted to be on its own. But when it came to the border wars, they usually split these places by geographic lines, and the Green Mountains, you can see the Green Mountains kind of form that spine there, and at one point it was thought that New Hampshire would take everything to the east and New York would get everything to the west. But Vermont flexed its own muscles and created its own state in 1790, nullifying everything. It was originally, it had more affinity for New York because most Vermont's good soils were mostly in the Champlain Valley. And because of the French and Indian War and more navigable waterways around Lake Champlain and the Hudson River and up into Canada, there was much more commerce on the western side of Vermont than there was on the eastern side of Vermont. So it had much more affinity with New York, but it ended up going its own way. Some earlier maps actually assign all of Vermont to New Hampshire, which would be interesting today, but it didn't actually work out that way for so many reasons. Some other things that you see here, it says emphatically that Maine, M-A-I-N, no E on Maine yet, because it was still just province of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which it says on this map. They hadn't even converted the state of Massachusetts yet into a state. It was still part of the Bay Colony. It says part of the province of Maine belonging to Massachusetts Bay. So Maine really didn't have any status. There was nothing known about the northern part of anything. And you just see it says part of Canada. It's very, very, very vague. But there are a couple of things that are interesting about it. So if you go right up to the top here, you'll see it says, the Indians report that the Connecticut River and a branch of the Sagadahoc are so near that there is but a short carrying place between them. Now they probably meant the Androscoggin, and short for Native Americans was probably a relative term, but there are places up there where the distance between the headwaters of the rivers is not that great. So somebody had gotten some information or done some homework there that was really kind of critical. And it also says the River Connecticut, right here, it says right down here, has been surveyed no further than Lancaster. So they had no idea from a navigability standpoint what was happening above there. We'll compare that to the description on the Carrigan map a little bit later. And it's also one of the first notations of the White Hills. That's what was always the White Hills or the Crystal Hills. But they're all clumped together and not named individually. Individual naming wouldn't happen for a little while, and we'll see that. But it says the Hampshire White Hills appear many leagues off at sea like great white clouds, just rising above the horizon, and are a noted landmark to seamen. So the skies were clear enough that when it was clear enough, they could actually use that as a navigable landmark. And then the last thing that's really interesting here is right here, it's near Lake Memphremagog, it says a pleasant plain country. So if you go up to the New Hampshire borderlands, and I know many of you have, and you look over into the Canadian side, it's mostly agriculture, and that agriculture is old. All this predated this. I mean, they had settled this, the St. Francis and the Chaudière River valleys off the St. Lawrence at least 150 years before New Hampshire even started thinking about navigation. So they were absolutely right. It's very fertile land. So there are some accuracies to that map in some very vague and random places. So that's it for that one. So the next map, which is this one, It looks like that, the treasure maps you used to get at Storyland with your kids, but it is a real map. This map was included in this 3-volume set of Jeremy Belknap's History of New Hampshire up to 1790. The map was in volume 1. The book states the events of one complete century and 75 years from the discovery of the river Piscataqua to the year 1790. There's also great geographic descriptions and sketches of natural history, productions, improvements, and the present state of society. Pretty ambitious. The northern boundary on this map is actually pretty close to what it should be. And we'll talk a lot about the northern boundary because it has a lot of relevance for us. Pretty close. The Dartmouth Grant is broadly identified. The Androscoggin River is now called the Ameroscoggin River. And the White Mountains are all clumped together again. It looks like one giant caldera, actually, in many ways. And 5 of the original New Hampshire counties are identified. The next map is actually quite a bit better map. I'm sorry.
What year was the Belknap?
Oh, I'm sorry. This one, 1790. So we're going to talk. You're going to see reference in some of the earlier maps to something called Mason's Patent, and Mason's Patent was a grant of land granted by the king to John Mason, who was one of the original settlers of New Hampshire, in 1629. It's an ambiguous wedge of land, but it ran from the center line of the Piscataqua River down here, 60 miles inland from Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, which is down here, to Conway. So this stretch, this whole chunk of land here, and we'll see it on some bigger maps, was granted to this one person. It never actually worked out for John Mason that way. And some people have it as an arc, and some people just drew it as a straight line. But early maps make it really, really clear. It was essentially a quarter of the state of New Hampshire, and all the way up and through the Merrimack River. It's one of the first descriptions of a notch. It just says the notch for Crawford Notch, even though, we know how many notches are there in New Hampshire. There's some debate about this, but according to the USGS, how many?
5 or 6?
28. New Hampshire. How many in Maine? They're all relatively local. All the main notches are local. 3, right? Evans, Hoosick, and there's Grafton. Yeah, right. I can name all the New Hampshire. I can't name all the New Hampshire notches, but I have them written down in case there was some smart person in the room. We also have 6 passes, 3 gaps, and 1 call. Vermont doesn't have, but Vermont only has 1 notch, that I know, Smuggler's Notch. Vermont has gaps. Difference between gaps and notches, generally speaking, gaps go east-west, notches northerly-southerly. So all the, like Middlebury Gap, Appalachian Gap, what's the other one, Emily? Brandon, yeah. They're all basically east-west, and notches are more north-south. So, and gap is more of a southern nomenclature anyway. But Vermont's been doing things their own way for years. So this map, this map by Lewis, and again, it says, "The State of New Hampshire" by Samuel Lewis, 1794, compiled chiefly from actual surveys. Actually, probably not right. This was printed in Philadelphia, the seat of U.S. printing at this time, all the way up into the 1850s, 1840s was Philadelphia, was the printing capital of the United States. There's a variation in this map on the notation about the White Hills, and they just said the White Hills appear many leagues off at sea like white clouds just rising above the horizon. So they probably stole it from the 1788 map and just reprinted it right onto there. Not being there, as I said, and borrowing were really, really common. There are very few cultural features with this map, but it has excellent longitudes and latitudes, as well as one of the first descriptions of 42,000 acres to Dartmouth College in the college grant. And in this map, Mason's patent line is missing. We'll see it reappear again. Maps like this map in particular was issued as part of an atlas atlases and I always say the two A words, atlases and almanacs, were the primary source of information for people way back when. Even now the Farmer's Almanac is still pretty important for a lot of people. But that was the people's primary source of information, geographic, social, cultural information. And these, the people who did this map, Carey and Lewis, were both fascinating guys. Samuel Lewis, who was the cartographer and engraver, he was based in Philadelphia. He was probably Irish-born, although we're not sure. He partnered with a British firm, Arrowsmith, which we'll see in a couple of other subsequent maps. But a little bit further in history, he's best known for producing the definitive map of Lewis and Clark's expedition, and the map came out in 1814, which is his best known work. But he was doing map work well before this. Again, it's amazing. It was published in 1814, and the expedition was done in 1806. So it took 8 years to compile all that information and get it into map form. The other printer and engraver here, Matthew Carey, he was Irish, but he was a progressive Irish, very anti-British, and he had to leave Ireland, as you can imagine. He fled to Paris, where he was befriended by none other than Ben Franklin, who was there at the time, fighting on our behalf for the revolution on the diplomatic mission. They became lifelong friends, and Carey emigrated to the US in 1784 after he got into trouble in Ireland again. And he worked for Franklin's presses both in Paris, he had a small press, and in Philadelphia, where he eventually started his own printing press with funds that he borrowed from the Marquis de Lafayette, who was introduced to him by Franklin. It's like 2 degrees of separation for all these guys. Because previously all the big printing was done in England and France. There wasn't much of a US printing commerce. So that's great. There's a map on the back here. I'm not going to spend hardly any time on it. It's small and pretty poor. Again, it's part of an atlas map, and it shows New Hampshire and Vermont together, which you'll often see in maps because they fit nicely together, and you could fit them both on one page. Unlike Maine, which was too big to fit on a page. Again, this is a fairly crude map. It doesn't demarcate even New Hampshire's eastern boundary. It just kind of lays it out there. It also shows the Connecticut River running into Canada. And again, Vermont is represented much better here than New Hampshire. But the good part is the latitudes and the longitudes are all really accurate, which is not always the case for this time. And they call the Androscoggin the Amanaskoggin River. So they're trying to get the name right. There's 3 different names for the same river. Great, that's all for that one, Ann. This little map doesn't look like much. Again, it's a standalone map of New Hampshire. Very simple, but it's very accurate for the northern border at the time. Is really not the case for most maps. It shows Portsmouth as the largest city, which I'm not sure if it was, and New Hampshire's population was at about 200 to 220,000 at the time. So New Hampshire was just starting to grow. Conway is mentioned by name, and they actually call the Androscoggin River the Androscoggin River. Lots of misspelled town names here. Freiburg, Lyme are misspelled, and Berlin and Milan were Mainsborough, Mainsburg, and Paulsboro. They just threw whatever name was out there to them.
Cartographers do that.
What's that?
Cartographers.
Yeah, right. This is probably a basic map, for professionals to hang on the wall. And it was nice that it was a standalone map of New Hampshire. Okay, so we go from the simple to the ridiculous right here. So we jump up, this map was 1805. So this is 1816 is the Kerrigan map. Now, the Kerrigan map, many of you know this map really well. I could do a whole day just on, you could do a whole presentation just on the Kerrigan map. It's a fascinating story. But it's the technical name of the official name of the map is New Hampshire by recent survey made under the supreme authority and published according to law. You don't get to hear that very often. Concord, New Hampshire, 1816. They came in different versions. This is the Society's map. I do have a copy of this map, and it was, I did get it framed, and I think Louise Perry down at Vintage is still cursing me for that, because it was a monstrous job for her to be able to frame it well. This was also printed in Philadelphia. And do you want to tell a little bit about how Jackson came across this map, or?
So, we at the Society were wondering, how did the Society even come onto this map? And it's kind of, the map is incredible. The history of it, there were only 250 of them printed back in 1813, was it? So, the story belongs to Warren. When the Society got the lease, we leased this building from the town. And Warren was up on the second floor, and it was getting cleaned out, and Warren said a road agent had this thing rolled up, it looked like some ratty thing under his arm, but Warren eyeballed it and saw that it was a map, and saw that it was headed to be thrown out. He didn't know what the map was, but he said, the Society will hold on to that. So here it is. Warren, it was discovered how valuable this could be, one of our most precious items in the building. And he had it sent to Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover, Mass. They're pros on restoration of items, and had it restored. It's in good shape. It's not in great shape, but it got saved and mounted on rice paper, Warren. And they did brought it back to life, and it's normally up in our museum on the second floor, but for today's program we brought it down, and we may leave it down for a bit so it stands up. And talking about all the rabbit holes you can go down, I read about the making of this map this morning, and it's unbelievable, the story. And it's dedicated to Gilman, who was governor at the time, and he commissioned or passed the legislation to require that this map get made. Oh, sorry. But Alice Pepper gave the Society a couple months ago a silver spoon that
See where I get it from.
that Alice was given the spoon in the summer or something, Alice, and it was found in the 1950s up at the Triangle in the dirt by a family, the Evans family. The children were playing in the dirt up there, and they found this spoon, and they held on to it all the time. It's inscribed October 22nd, 1874. It says initials in Gilman. So I'm going to research, but Gilman here, I thought, is this the Gilman? So TV to tell you soon. But so many rabbits. Okay.
Right, yeah.
I better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shut up. Now I have to go dig through this and chunk some stuff out.
I'm just going to leave these here.
Yeah, well, pass them out.
Okay.
Keep looking up. So what else is interesting about this map? It's so wonderful that it's preserved and it's accurate. I mean, these maps were hung on dowels, and that's the way big maps were done back then. They didn't have the framing capacity to do that. So you'll see some other dowel hung maps, and that's the way they were meant to be displayed and hung up in very prominent places. Quite honestly, this is the granddaddy of mapping in New Hampshire. At the time, probably, it definitely was at the time, and it has held the test of time. Not only for its accuracy, but for its size and scope. It was one of the first maps to use engravings. You see engravings in the corners. That wasn't very common back then. And what was interesting about it was that it was made from 6 sheets of paper. 6 broad sheets of paper. And a broad sheet, for those who used to read newspapers, a broadsheet was the biggest piece of paper you could get at the time from a rolling press. So they glued 6 broadsheets together, which is 22 by 28 inches, and then they came up with the full map. This map, the manuscript map of the Kerrigan map, preceded this by a year. But you see, it has it has 2 engravings, but it doesn't have any of the fluff that the other map has. This is a reproduction, or a reduced reproduction. This map, the manuscript map from 1815, is actually slightly larger than this map. So So you can go to, you can see them, but this is, again, just to reduce burden. But the interior is all very accurate and was just reproduced in its final form. Sorry. So this is one of an estimated, nobody knows for sure, the original printing was supposed to be 500 maps. It took so long to get this map done that they knocked it down to 250. So this is one of an estimated 250 maps. There was one produced for every town in New Hampshire, the academies, they say, which probably means colleges and academies, and county courthouses. 1H equals 3 miles, and there are views of the White Mountains. It's the first engraved view of the White Mountains you can see down there from Shelburne. They make them look like volcanoes, but they are, that is called the White Hills. But it's the story behind this that's really, really interesting. It's accurate. The town boundaries are accurate. There are factories, mills, churches, universities, courthouses, academies. It has other things like, you see this guy hunting a moose here, and there's people dip netting for salmon or alewife, which you could still do back then because the rivers weren't dammed yet. So it was a pretty easy way to get food. There's the first naming of what we now call Lafayette. They called it Great Haystack, and Cannon was called Frank Mountain, probably for Franconia Mountain. Mount Washington had been named by this point, but it's not labeled on this map. It's again showed mostly as like a giant caldera. This was a monument of mapping in New Hampshire. And the ancient curve line, you can see when you get up closer, shows the Mason's patent curve line, which they put in for historical purposes. By this time, Mason's patent had been deemed null and void by the state of New Hampshire. Mason and his descendants weren't going to get all this land that they thought they were going to get, so they just basically took it from them. Excellent maps, as we see earlier, were produced later in the last century, but there are huge gaps in the White Mountains and the North Country, and the state of New Hampshire's push for development, as well as trying to sell some land, really drove this map. This happened by act of legislature. Each town, and by act of legislature in 1803, each town was required to conduct an accurate survey at its own cost by standard measures set by the state, using a specific scale. Major features were also to be added, including mills, houses, meeting houses, churches, as well as coordinates and length of town boundaries. This required, one, towns to work together. We know how well that goes a lot of times. And we also know that in remote towns like our town, which on 3 sides has no other town near it, they had to do all this themselves. They basically had to go out and survey all this land themselves. Very difficult indeed. As I said, the project began in 1803 with an act of legislature, and Phil Kerrigan wasn't a map maker, wasn't a surveyor. He was the Secretary of State at the time. Died in 1842. Ben English, I know Ben's here. Favorite mountain is named Kerrigan, and one of my favorites, one of the best views in the White Mountains. He compiled all the surveys from the towns during his tenure as Secretary of State from 1805 to 1808. I can't imagine what else he did. And the work wasn't completed until the map was finished in 1816, probably because of the poor quality of the survey. It took them that long. There were a lot of rewrites and lots of reworks of this map. But the boundaries for most every town in New Hampshire is accurate to this day. So this is the map that set the boundaries. The reduced copy is, again, as I said, slightly larger. So some of the small inscriptions are really, really interesting and really, really inaccurate. There's a reference here to the Battle of Lovewell Pond, which we all know pretty much wiped out the Native American population in this neck of the woods in 1725. On the side here, and that's the writing right there. It's really hard to see without a magnifying glass. It says the head of boat navigation was in Haverhill at the confluence of Wells River, and it says, quote, the navigation of this river must at no very distant period be open to its parent lake. From latitude 45 it passes about 400 and I can't read what it says, 400 something through a soil scarcely surpassed in fertility and a dense population, highly advanced in the arts and scientific and moral refinement. Its banks are the Garden of New England. I think it was clearly a stretch to say he knew what he was talking about going up to the headwaters of Connecticut, but it was clearly an enticement for people to start to move north. The height of land that we see up here in the writing is accurately described with the 4 main river systems, 2 heading into Canada, and the 2, the Androscoggin and the Connecticut, and the boundary is very accurate for the time. Most of the subsequent maps don't come close to it. There is, and Kevin, I'm glad you're here, Kevin Evans, Dartmouth Forester. There's a line in here that I don't know about, and it's in the college grant right here, and it says, road cut by Major J. Eames for the New York purchasers. And I have no idea what that means, but it's in there. It's right through the college grant, the original college grant thing. The population of every town is on this map in the town. Adams at the time was 244 residents, and the road, quote unquote road, stopped at where roughly the Dana place is. So we were kind of the end of the line. And the arch inscription, the really, really important one about the White Mountains right here, reads, the White Mountains, like all other high mountains, chiefly consist of granite. So far, so good. No correct, I don't understand this, but I'm going to read it. No correct trigonomical calculation has yet been made of their height by barometric observations. However, they have been recently computed not to be 7,162 feet above the level of the ocean, as they are below the line of perpetual congregation, which must be there 72 feet lower than in Europe. On the same parallel, their height cannot exceed 7,800 feet. After every abridgment of the heretofore exaggerated estimates of their altitude, it will be found doubly to exceed that of any mountain in the U.S. other than those of New Hampshire. They had no idea what they were talking about. Aside from the mountains in North Carolina and Tennessee, they were right. They were the highest mountains, but not by the amount that they said. And we continue to get the elevations wrong on Mount Washington for the next 50 years. So they weren't the first, they weren't the last. Again, just a fascinating map. You could spend, there's other vignettes I won't have time to talk about, but there's a really good article in Historical New Hampshire called The Making of the Kerrigan Map of New Hampshire 1803 to 1816 from 1997. It's just simply a treasure, and the society's lucky to have it. So thanks for sharing it. So now we get down to some more basic maps, but kind of interesting in their own right, because we get into a lot more of what I call learned New Hampshire. So the next map here is called the Geographical, Historical, and Statistical Map of New Hampshire by Carey and Lee, the same Carey that produced this map. It was engraved in Philadelphia. You can see it was part of a much larger, big folio atlas of every state up till the time. They must have had to crank out these atlases like one a year, because we were getting new states every 2 or 3 years, so it was great business for them to just be adding new states in atlases. I don't know how they kept up with it. It has an excellent historical description of New Hampshire, including Mason's patent, beautiful hand coloring, and again, this was all done by hand, mostly by women. Did most of the coloring of maps. The borders, especially the northern border, is just kind of vague. You'll see that it's a very common. But the boundaries, the town boundaries, were taken probably straight from Kerrigan because they're almost identical. There's still no mention of Mount Washington or elevations, and the weather is described in this New Hampshire as being serene all year round. They call it the Androscoggin River again. We still haven't come up with a name. And the last line says it all. If you read it right there, it says, since the adoption of the federal constitution, no event of historical importance has occurred in New Hampshire. Cut it right off there. I guess they just didn't think the War of 1812 really had much relevance for us or anybody else. So it's funny what they do say. So the next map over is a very rare map because it shows 3 states at not only at just the start of their statehood. Maine. This was a map of Maine, obviously New Hampshire and Vermont, compiled from the latest authorities as always. by a really famous map maker named Anthony Finley. He did a lot of really good maps. Beautiful color in this map, shows a lot of the county very accurately. The other thing that it shows, it's one of the first maps to show the high points of all the 3 states, Katahdin, Mansfield, and Mount Washington. At this point, New Hampshire was the least populated state in northern New England in 1810. But by 1820 we would pass Vermont, and by 1850 we would pass Maine. So there was a lot happening. Maine was actually the leader for many years. Even though it wasn't a state until 1823, it had a higher population than both New Hampshire and Vermont. The mountains are named, but nobody risked the elevation again. I don't think anybody had the courage to put the elevation on. The northern borders here of Maine and New Hampshire are very vague, once again. And the demarcation of it's hard to see right here, Hall Stream in New Hampshire is the correct boundary, and it is to this day. The main border with New Brunswick along the green here, the eastern side, would be shifted after this map. You see it looks a little off and it's not really squared. There was a small little fight between Canada and the US called the Aroostook War in 1838, 1839, which necessitated the need for the treaty in 1842. So they were still fighting about all these boundaries until they got to the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842. So does anybody know when Quebec started being called Quebec? It's always Lower Canada, up until 1867, which was the confederation of the original 4 provinces of Canada, were Quebec and Ontario, which were considered the province of Canada. They split them in half. The west was Ontario, the east was Quebec, and the other 2 were New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Those are the 4 original confederation provinces from 1867. Locally, the town of Stowe is known as Batchelder, and Lovell is Lovett. And this map reverts to many Native American names for all the rivers and lakes. I'm cruising right through here because I'm looking at the time. I said an hour. Number 8 is a really interesting map. It's framed. If you look at it, it's very fragile. It came out of this book, this little book right here, which is a beautiful little book, which also has another map in it, just of the state of New Hampshire. I don't know where it came from. Has no identifying features. This map was tipped in at the back of this book. This is a fascinating little book. The color on it was probably redone at some point for the boundary lines. You can see vague color in the counties. But what's important for us here was this was the first map that I know of to name Jackson. And it's even more interesting because later on we'll see future maps where Jackson up until 1860 is still called Adams. So the map makers were either lazy or dumb. They just didn't care because we were in the middle of the sticks. They didn't think anybody would mind. They misname it and put it in the wrong place. So it's fascinating because this book came out 1831, and that map came out in 1831. So Jackson changed its name. 1828 election was held. Elections back then weren't one day. They were months, 3 months usually. They took end of October into December, January. And Andrew Jackson didn't begin his term until March of 1829. This election was a rematch from 1824 with John Quincy Adams. And even though Jackson had the most electoral votes in 1824, John Quincy Adams won the election in the House of Representatives because nobody had a majority. So it was different rules back then. But people did not like that, obviously, and it really came a long way in solidifying the 2-party system that we're more familiar with today. So in 1828, the election, all of New England voted for Adams because he was a Massachusetts man, with the exception of Coos County, which is what we were part of back then. They voted for Jackson. So to kind of thumb their nose in it, on the second Tuesday in March in 1829, 315 residents gathered, not in this building, but somewhere in town, and voted at town meeting to change the name from Adams to Jackson. One resident dissented from that vote. Does anybody know who that resident was? Famous person, famous family in Jackson. Spencer Wentworth of the Wentworth family was the one dissenting vote, the one to keep. So we were again part of Coos County at that time, from Grafton. Many of the current names for towns, Jackson, one of the earliest depictions of Berlin and Milan, opposed to their old names, although some old names still are on there, like Burton, for Albany was originally called Burton, is still on there. And what's also interesting in the book is the town of Eaton's population was larger than Conway's at the time, because Eaton and Madison were joined. They hadn't split, so Eaton and Madison had a higher population than Conway did, which I think is fascinating. Don't you want to go back to those days, Marty? Our population at the time was about 269,000, so just in that short period of time we gained about 45,000 people, which was a lot. Although Coos County, which we were a part of, only had 5,251 residents. So there were not a lot of people up here. This book was really the name of the book. I'll read it. It says it on the map too. Where is it? I thought I had it marked. Sorry. Right here. It says Geography of New Hampshire with a new map of the state. They were right about that. For families and schools, embracing a study of topographical and historical sketch of every town, a general view of each county and a general view of the state, its natural features, a glossary explaining the geographic terms, and questions for students. So every town, they wanted you to draw every town boundary. It's a great little book. I mean, and what it says about, it says about Jackson, it's the first white family that lived in this township came here during the American Revolution and continued 14 years in the place without neighbors. Jackson lies east of the White Mountains in the southeast part of Coos County. It contains 5 or 6 high elevations, of which Black and Thorn Mountains are among the steepest and loftiest. The soil in the township is generally good. Maybe down in the valley, but not. If they like rocks, it was good. So it was, it was a really good attempt. And 1831, people were educating at home still. There weren't schools everywhere, so books like this were indispensable for learning about where you lived. It also does a good job. It delineates 8 counties with the addition of Sullivan and Merrimack counties right here and right here. It's split off from Stratford County and Hillsborough. Okay, next map, we're getting there. Next map is a series of maps that I have here. And you want to go just do them one at a time? That's all right. There's nothing really special about these maps except that they're all wrong. These are a series of 5 maps from 1826 to 1850, all showing either New Hampshire or New Hampshire and Vermont. Again, Maine wasn't included. The first map is an 1826 map by Anthony Finley, and it's established Merrimack County. It delineates Adams in the middle of the Wild River, I don't even know where they thought it was, near Perkins Notch. The northern boundaries are vague, and they call the Androscoggin the Ameroscoggin River. The next one. Next one is an 1835 map of New Hampshire and Vermont from Bradford, who's the publisher, from a comprehensive atlas. One of the first maps, this is one of the first maps that tried to take a crack at the elevation of Mount Washington at 6,640 feet. Not too bad for the day. It says that there's a notch, but it's Pinkham Notch. They kind of ditched Crawford at that point. And Adams and Chatham are reversed in the nomenclature. Even though we had changed our name 4 years ago, they still called us Adams. So next. Next one is an 1838 map. And again, these maps are being cranked out on a regular basis. There are a lot more than these out there. This is another map from Bradford. The northern boundary is terrible. It's just chopped off. But it's one of the first maps to show all 10 counties of New Hampshire. Even though we still are in Coos County, it shows 10 counties, which is really interesting since the counties weren't established until 1840 and this map came out in 1838. So either they were really smart or really lucky. Bartlett and Jackson, as I said, are still part of COAS, and we're still called Adams. What's also instructive about this map is right here, you see the first pinch of a railroad coming in. So 1838, the railroads were just starting to make their way in to New Hampshire. Just a year later, in 1839, this is a different publisher, Tanner, a map of New Hampshire and Vermont. Very colorful, beautiful little map. The railroad at that point, in just a year, they punched it all the way to Concord. So the railroads were coming. It's an accurate depiction of our northern boundary here, much more so than the previous maps, but we are still Adams, and we're back to 8 counties. So these things, they didn't always go in sequential order. And then the last one I'll show here, and yeah, that's it. This is another greenleaf map of Vermont and New Hampshire. We still have 8 counties. What's fascinating about this map, it's from an English publisher, so they show the whole of this part of New Hampshire right here as belonging to Canada. And it was the year of the treaty, so they were saying, this is where we think it should go, even if it doesn't go. The Indian Stream Republic, is anybody familiar with the Indian Stream Republic, declared independence from both Canada and the US in 1832. They said, if you guys can't figure it out, we'll be our own republic. And from 1832 to 1835, they were. They had their own government, their own constitution, but New Hampshire said enough of that. In 1836, they were annexed by New Hampshire. No, in 1835, they were annexed by New Hampshire. The sheriff showed up with 2 companies of militia stationed in Stewartstown, ready to enforce our claims. The sheriff met with 40 of the residents, and they decided to become American citizens. And so they staved off invasion. They agreed to be annexed. The British were not happy about this in Sherbrooke, and a border crisis continued into the next year, where we actually had militia stationed in the Indian Stream for about a year and a half. They resolved in 1836 to stay with the United States, but again, it was a little bit of an international crisis between the British ambassador and President Jackson, who was only 20 years removed from, only 30 years, moved from the War of 1812. He had no love for the British, Jackson did. He won the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. He wasn't going to back down. So the British eventually did back down, and the Indian Stream was incorporated into the town of Pittsburgh proper in 1840, and both sides agreed to the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. So our boundaries were finally pretty much set, except if you live down in Kittery and are part of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. That's still ping-ponging back and forth, although it's part of me. But they hedged their bets, they were wrong, so sometimes wrong maps are more interesting than right maps, and I think that's the case in here. And then the last one, second to last one, I'm sorry.
No, it's the last.
1850. Yeah, that's right. Sorry. Map of New Hampshire and Vermont by Copperthwaite and Mitchell. This was an accurate map with 10 counties. Jackson is properly named and situated, although we're still named as part of Coos County. So 2 out of 3 is not bad. The northern border is correct. We passed Vermont in population, and you see railroads pretty much starting to come in everywhere. Although the Gorham line, through the St. Lawrence and Atlantic, hadn't shown, is not on this map. It was right at the border at 1850, so it was really, really close. It shows proposed canals in the southern part of the state, never built. And the road, it's the first description of the road through Evans Notch into Chatham, through Chatham and through Evans Notch up into Maine. So, and then the final map of the day, which is we're going to move that 3-state map. This is a map that the Society owns and is up on the wall there, but it's in pretty rough condition. It's this one in the back here. So we're going to end on this map. This is a map of New Hampshire by Jacob Richards Dodge in 1854, published by Bradford and Company. Its technical name is the Township and Railroad Map, so that says it all. of New Hampshire, compiled from the best authorities and with corrections and town lines from actual surveys. Railroads are here. This is also one of the first maps to use a lithograph technique of printing rather than just copper plate engraving or a wood plate engraving. It's a different technique using usually limestone, acid and fat to get the result that you want. You can get it's finer, more accurate. I'm not an expert on lithography, although it was a fairly new invention at the time. It was invented in Germany right around 1795, 1796. So it was starting to, and this is what you would see for a lot of maps coming out in the future. That map is completely original. Again, it was meant to be on dowels, hung, so you can imagine it in front of a courthouse or a doctor's office or whatever. It's backed by really old, fragile linen. It's just a good map, and it really shows the future. White Mountains and Mount Washington are delineated. They call Crawford Notch Tom Crawford's Notch. Nashua, Portsmouth, Manchester, and Concord are all featured, but it gives you detailed demographic statistics about wool, cotton, iron, flax. New Hampshire was a leading producer of flax at this time in world flax production, which was being spun because we were trying to get off of cotton because we didn't want to use slave cotton. So in northern parts of New England, they were moving to flax, which was not nearly as comfortable as cotton, but it's better than nothing. It was much more accurate information in general. Due to the census and taxes, we're finally listed as part of Carroll County. So this is what you would consider a modern map. Jackson has listed as 589 residents, and our total town valuation at the time was $112,000. So all the rail lines are there going into Gorham, and the southern lines stopping in Meredith and Alton and Milton. So they're all making their way up here, but it took them a while. The most common way to get here still from there or wherever was to take the train from Boston to Alton Bay, get on a ferry, go across Alton Bay, get on the stagecoach, and ride the stagecoach up till the train came. This changed when the Gorham, the St. Lawrence and Atlantic line came in. They ran a special where you would take a steamship from New York to Boston, have a 1 hour layover, take the train from Boston to Portland, have another 1 hour layover, and take the train from Portland to Gorham for the whopping sum of $12.50, meals included. 36 hours. But compared to what it took prior to that, it was probably like going to the moon. It was earth-shattering. So now we had ready access to all the major metropolitan markets, and more importantly, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is the real reason the Portland, St. Lawrence and Atlantic was built, was to reach the St. Lawrence Seaway. Jacob Dodge, fascinating guy who created this map. He was a New Hampshire native, born in New Boston, worked in Nashua. He was a statistics nut. He worked for the Department of Agriculture for 3 years, for 30 years, as the agricultural statistician for the country. Published a book on statistics, as well as books on Native Americans in West Virginia oil wells. He was writing about everything. So with that map, the future was here. It was coming, and then the next, you'll see that that's a much more ornate map. It has the engravings, but you'll start to see the pull of tourists up and commerce goods down, and that's what we'll focus on for our next. Yeah, April sometime. Let me on the 23rd. The next presentation that Anna is strong-armed me into doing is on April 23rd. It'll be more on White Mountain maps from 1852 to 1902. And many of those maps, not all of them, many will be really much more familiar to them. It's, as I said, the era of railroads, tourism, and timber, grand hotels, and how maps from this era define the region. Bigger maps too, so you won't have to squint as much. And other things we're thinking about in the future are early White Mountain guides. Most people think White Mountain guides, they think of AMC White Mountain guides, but guides were being published on the White Mountains as early as the 1840s. We'll talk about them. White Mountain trail maps and guides. And then one that I'm really excited about, I'm still working on, we came up with the name, is Women Cartographers, Map Makers, Illustrators, and Map Influencers in the White Mountains in New Hampshire from the 20s to the 1920s to the 1980s. I don't know anything about this, but we're gonna figure it out. All just concepts, so if you have any preferences, let me know. Thanks so much. I know I went a little bit over, and I'd love to answer any questions.
All right.
That's it.
Before it gets noisy with people leaving, maybe a couple questions, just a couple, or if
What's the value of that big map?
Depending on.
what's the value of the
Big Carrigan map, depending on condition, Paul, $8,000 to $10,000. There's not that, you know, they're not making them anymore. So, yeah.
The very early maps that you showed, who were the actual commissioners of those maps? Who actually paid to have them done?
Well, this map was commissioned for the book, for Belknap's book, as part of the book. This one was part of an atlas, so it was probably for the atlas company to sell as part of a larger piece. That would be my guess. That's a good question. I'm not 100% sure.
But the Carrigan was state legislature.
Yeah, that was the only one that was enacted by legislature. Yeah.
So were the printers the people who actually coded the information? Were they responsible for the content?
No, generally no. They all had information. It would all be sent to them. And it was oftentimes a two-step process. The engraver was different. There was a cartographer, an engraver, and the map printer. So it was a multi-step process, which is probably another reason why information got lost. It was like playing telephone, and they were doing it over great distances, and they were spitballing it a lot of times, as we saw so many times. Yeah, Randy.
Was selection navigation the only means these guys had with photographers originally, or did they use some sort of depth reckoning?
For the actual surveying?
For the longitudes.
Oh, I think the original longes and lats came from Celestial, but the detail in this book about the actual survey methods were rods and chains. It was literally going out there with chains and walking the line. And it wasn't too long ago. I don't know if I answered your question.
Going back to Lewis and Clark, they just compiled a whole bunch of selections that they had.
Right.
Back to Philadelphia, and we figured out kind of where they were. Amazingly accurate.
Yeah.
There was nothing else, no GPS back in those days.
Right. Well, and up until a few years ago, it was part of the town crew's job to survey the town line on a regular basis. They would paint and blaze and brush a section of the line every year and split it with the town next to them. I don't think that pretty much happens anymore. So there's probably some old blazes out there up in the sticks if you want to go try and find them. But,
All right, maybe afterwards you can come up and
I'll be here.
he will be here for a bit. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for coming.